I never thought moving back home would turn into something so intense. My plan was simple: save some money, get a steady job, and then move out again as soon as possible. It felt strange at first, coming back to the same rooms, the same halls I'd grown up in. But what surprised me most was how much the dynamics in the house had shifted, especially since my mom had remarried while I was away. My mom's new husband, Mark, seemed all right, though we didn't interact much. But then there was his daughter, Claire. The first time I met her, I thought she was quiet, polite, maybe even a bit shy. But over time, I started noticing the subtle energy she carried, one that was hard to ignore. We became friends quickly. Living under the same roof will do that. But as weeks went by, I found myself noticing her in ways I wasn't proud of. We'd bump into each other in the hall or find ourselves alone in the living room, talking late into the night. Her laughter was infectious, and the way she looked at me, well, it was impossible not to notice. One evening, everything changed. The house was quiet. My mom and Mark had gone out for dinner, and Claire and I were the only ones home. I was in the shower, lost in thought, when I heard the bathroom door creak open. I hadn't bothered locking it since I didn't think anyone would come in. But suddenly there was Claire, standing in the doorway, just as surprised as I was. Our eyes met, and neither of us moved. She glanced away quickly, but didn't leave. Instead, she seemed frozen, hesitating as if waiting for something. Her gaze met mine again, her expression unreadable, and a charged silence hung between us. I couldn't tell what she was thinking, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, something that was about to change everything. After that evening, things felt different between us. Whenever our paths crossed, there was a tension, a silent acknowledgement of that moment. She didn't bring it up, nor did I, but in the days that followed, Claire and I found ourselves around each other more often, as though neither of us could stay away. One afternoon, I was in the living room, flipping through channels when Claire walked in and sat down next to me, closer than she normally would. It was subtle, but I noticed it, the way her hand brushed against mine, lingering just a second longer than it should have. "Hey," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that made the air between us feel heavier. "Hey," I replied, not looking at her, my focus on the television screen, though I wasn't taking in a single thing. My heart was pounding. Neither of us moved, but the room suddenly felt smaller, like everything outside of this moment had faded away. Without a word, Claire leaned her shoulder against mine, the warmth of her presence wrapping around me like a quiet secret. The tension that had been growing between us was almost unbearable, like a spark that couldn't be ignored anymore. It was one of those late nights when we found ourselves alone in the house again. I'd just come into the kitchen to grab a drink when I saw Claire, sitting at the counter, scrolling through her phone. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, looking up at me with a soft smile. "Yeah," I said, pulling up a chair across from her. "Just couldn't switch off, I guess." We fell into easy conversation, and for a while, it felt like old times, like when we first met. But eventually, silence fell between us, and that familiar tension crept in. Claire's gaze lingered on me, her eyes thoughtful, as if she were deciding something. The air was thick, almost as if we were waiting for something to break. "I feel like we've been avoiding something," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I met her eyes, feeling the weight of what she wasn't saying. And in that silence, the words didn't matter. We both knew. Our hands brushed together, and in that quiet moment, it felt like the last of our defenses fell. I felt her hand tighten, holding on, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself be swept up in the closeness, in the feeling that maybe this connection between us was something we'd been trying to ignore for too long. In the days that followed, the distance we'd once kept between us vanished completely. When we were alone, there were no boundaries, just moments charged with unspoken understanding. It wasn't just about proximity or flirtation anymore. There was an intensity in every glance, every touch that neither of us could deny. And somehow, even in a full house, we found ways to steal moments for ourselves. One evening, our parents were both out, and we ended up on the back porch watching the sunset. The air was still and warm, wrapping around us like a quiet secret. We stood side by side, the closeness between us both thrilling and terrifying. Claire leaned her head on my shoulder, and without thinking, I reached out and wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. There was a vulnerability in that moment, a silent confession that neither of us dared put into words. "I don't know how we got here," I whispered, breaking the silence. She looked up at me, her hazel eyes soft and searching. "Maybe it was meant to happen," she murmured, her voice barely audible. We sat like that, not saying anything more, letting the warmth and the quiet settle around us. And for the first time, I felt something close to peace, a strange, conflicted peace, but peace nonetheless. It wasn't long before the subtle shifts in our relationship started catching our parents' attention. They'd exchange looks when they noticed Claire and me talking quietly, but we always played it off, pretending everything was as it should be. Every day, we were walking a finer line, trying to keep the truth hidden while navigating our parents' questions and growing suspicions. The risk should have stopped us, but it didn't. If anything, it only seemed to pull us closer together, like we were living in a world of our own creation, one that couldn't be touched by anyone else. But the weight of the secret was beginning to press down on me, especially when I looked at my mom and knew what she would feel if she found out. One night, as we sat alone in the kitchen, Claire must have sensed the turmoil in me. She reached out, placing a hand on mine, her eyes full of empathy. "We don't have to keep doing this," she whispered, though there was a sadness in her voice that mirrored my own. But before I could answer, I found myself shaking my head. "No, I don't want to stop." A small smile played on her lips, and she squeezed my hand. "Then we're in this together, for however long it lasts." The inevitable moment came one rainy evening. Claire and I were in the living room, lost in quiet conversation, when the front door opened. Our parents walked in, soaked from the rain, but instead of hurrying off to dry off, they both froze, looking at us with suspicion. My mom's gaze lingered on our hands, which were resting just a little too close together. The silence was deafening, and for a split second, everything came crashing down. I tried to pull away, but Claire held my hand firmly, her gaze steady as she met her father's eyes. "What's going on here?" my stepdad asked, his voice laced with confusion and a hint of something darker. For a moment, I was at a loss for words. All the carefully constructed walls we'd built around our secret were crumbling, and there was no denying the truth anymore. My mom's face fell, her expression one of dawning realization. I couldn't bring myself to look at her, knowing that the hurt in her eyes would be more than I could bear. It's not what you think," I started, though even as I spoke I knew there was no salvaging this. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The family I'd grown up with was now fractured, and there was no mending what we had broken. Claire and I avoided each other, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on us like a storm that wouldn't pass. The once familiar warmth of our home felt cold, and the silence between us all was filled with so much left unsaid. My mom and Mark tried to move past it, but the strain in their relationship was clear. Conversations were shorter, dinners quieter, and the house felt more like a place full of strangers than a home. The guilt weighed on me daily, yet I couldn't shake the feelings I still had for Claire, even though I knew they had cost me everything. Eventually, Claire and I had a quiet conversation, both of us admitting that what had once felt so right now seemed too heavy to carry. We agreed to let go, to find a way to move forward separately, though it wasn't easy. Looking back, I realized that sometimes curiosity and attraction can lead you down paths you never intended to take. And sometimes the thrill of the moment doesn't outweigh the cost. As the months went by, the tension in the house gradually softened, though the memories and the consequences remained a constant undercurrent. My mom and stepdad did their best to rebuild their trust, and eventually, the silences became less charged. For me, though, it felt like I was living in the shadow of my own choices, and I knew that things would never quite go back to the way they were. Claire and I barely spoke after that day, a silent agreement that whatever had been between us was over. There was an unspoken understanding that we were both trying to move forward, but every now and then, our eyes would meet across the room, and I could see the same mix of regret and nostalgia in her gaze that I felt. In time, I moved out, eager to start fresh somewhere away from the weight of the past. The distance helped, and slowly, the memories faded into a quiet part of my mind. I threw myself into work, into building a new life where no one knew the history I carried. The guilt lingered, but grew less consuming, like an old scar that sometimes ached but no longer defined me. Years later, I found myself back in my hometown for a brief visit, this time as a guest rather than a resident. My mom had organized a small family gathering, and Claire would be there too. A part of me dreaded seeing her, wondering if the past would come rushing back, but another part of me was curious, hoping to see that she, too, had moved forward. When I arrived, I was struck by how much had changed. Claire was there, her hair a little shorter, her demeanor more reserved. We greeted each other politely, an understanding passing between us that was softer now, shaped by time and distance. The memories were still there, but they felt like echoes of a different time, a reminder of a chapter that had been closed and left behind. As the evening unfolded, we found ourselves outside, standing together on the back porch, much like we had years before. This time, though, there was no tension, no unspoken attraction, just a quiet understanding. We shared a brief conversation about our lives, filling each other in on all the things we'd missed, and it was like speaking with someone who had once been close but was now a stranger in many ways. "I'm glad you're doing well," she said, offering a small smile that held no hint of the past. "Same for you," I replied, and I meant it. Whatever we'd shared, whatever we'd gone through, we had both emerged on the other side, carrying the lessons, but no longer weighed down by them. Looking back, that time of my life felt like a strange, hazy memory, a lesson in the complexities of relationships and the impact of choices. I'd learned that some lines are crossed at a cost, and sometimes the thrill isn't worth the fallout. I was grateful for the distance and for the peace that came with it. That chapter had closed, leaving both Claire and me with a clearer understanding of ourselves and the boundaries we needed to respect. We had both moved on, and while the memories would always be there, they no longer held the power they once did. As I left that gathering and headed back to my own life, I felt lighter, finally at peace with the past. I had found my footing again, and the life I was building felt solid, rooted in lessons learned and the wisdom that comes from making mistakes and moving past them. And as I drove away, I knew that what I had now was more than enough, proof that sometimes, even after the hardest lessons, you can still find a way forward. Leaving the gathering felt like shedding the last of the weight I'd carried for years. With every mile that stretched between me and that old life, I felt a new sense of clarity. The complexities of those relationships, Claire, my family, and the choices I'd made, were now behind me, fading into the distance like the horizon in my rearview mirror. I'd spent so long carrying the guilt and regret, letting it define me, that it was almost strange to feel them finally loosening their grip. For the first time, I felt ready to face the future without that shadow hanging over me. I'd learned that life has a way of leading you down unexpected paths, but it also offers a way forward if you're willing to face the truth and make peace with your past. When I arrived back in my new town, I felt like I was seeing it with fresh eyes. I took a long walk through the neighborhood, feeling a quiet appreciation for the life I had now. It wasn't perfect, and there would always be struggles, but it was my life, free of the complications and regrets that had once defined it. Years later, I got a call from my mom, catching up on family news and the ordinary details of life. Claire was engaged, she said, to someone she'd met at work. There was a lightness in my mom's voice, as if time had truly healed, and I felt nothing but happiness for her, hoping she'd found the kind of connection we'd both once searched for in all the wrong ways. As I hung up the phone, I realized I hadn't thought of that chapter of my life in a long time. It was a strange feeling, knowing that what had once consumed me so completely was now a distant memory, something I could look back on without the rush of regret or the sting of mistakes. Life had moved on, as it always does, carrying me forward one day at a time. In the end, I had built something stronger, something real that couldn't be shaken by fleeting moments of passion or bad decisions. The memories remained, but they were quiet now, a part of the past that no longer defined me. And as I stood there, surrounded by the life I'd made for myself, I knew I was finally free.